Hi, my name is Deanna Cantu, and my research project is on Siegfried and Roy. This is one of their biographies, Mastering the Impossible, the Truth Behind the Magic. And so the main reason why I wanted to focus on this project is because I need to finally figure out, how do you spell Siegfried? Is it the I before the R? Is it F-R-I-E-D? We're going to figure that out. In all seriousness, as you could see from those paintings behind me, I love the Nevada community that is Las Vegas. Here you're seeing a montage of my family visiting the Strip this past summer for a Journey concert, and while I had a lot of fun there, just like most tourists, I wanted to know more about the city's arguably greatest act that ever lived. Siegfried and Roy set the stage back in the 1970s for these family shows that, over time, brought in massive financial benefits for Las Vegas's economy, up until the infamous 2003 tiger attack. This incident is the main focus of my research, not necessarily what should or shouldn't have been done to prevent the October 3rd, 2003 attack, but more so on how different news outlets covered the event. What were the initial reports? What did journalists get wrong? What did they get right? What theories were spread about the tiger attack that later had to be clarified? Whose stories get to be heard, and who was kind of left off to the sidelines? So, out of everything that's going on in the world right now, why is it important to talk about a couple of magicians and their white tigers? Well, actually, Siegfried and Roy's legacy is starting to pop back up in headlines. Most notably with the Mirage set to close soon, and because questions still remain about the animals who lived at their secret garden and dolphin habitat. Emmy-winning filmmaker and journalist Stephen Leckhart's first podcast, Wild Things, Siegfried and Roy, made its debut on Apple TV Plus this past January, which has also revitalized the relevancy of unanswered questions surrounding the controversial legacy of the duo. For a bit of background, they had some humble beginnings with Chico the Cheetah, who they snuck aboard their German luxury cruise ship back in 1957. Their break came in Monte Carlo Casino when an agent in the audience invited them to Las Vegas. The pair made their debut at the Tropicana Hotel Casino in the late 1960s, and they later moved on to the Mirage. And that last quote is paraphrased from the Associated Press in a 2020 report about Roy Horn's death. It's important for me to clarify here that Roy Horn did not die immediately after the attack. The 380-pound white tiger sank its teeth into Horn's neck and dragged him off stage in front of a horrified audience on October 3rd, 2003. The animal damaged an artery carrying oxygen to the magician's brain and crushed his windpipe. That mauling left Horn, who was 60 at the time, partially paralyzed and ended the long-running Siegfried and Roy production. Now, sadly, Roy Horn has passed away. He actually died from COVID nearly 17 years after that tiger attack at the Mirage. A common practice I found with the initial reports that came out during that same month is 1. A reliance on eyewitnesses, and 2. Multiple unconfirmed theories. This ranges from real estate mogul Steve Wen's later debunked theory that this woman with a high hairdo somehow distracted the white tiger. And there were some news reports that claimed this could be a possible terrorist attack. While these theories didn't help spread the truth about what actually happened, it did create this trend of, hey, here's this person connected to Siegfried and Roy who has some theory, so we're going to run it because it's October 2003, and this is the biggest story in the world right now. Of course, not all of the developing news coverage that came out in the weeks after the attack were like this. One great example in my research comes from Robert Macy's article that came out just 4 days after the attack. Macy had been covering the duo for 22 years up to that point, and I think in this article he does a great job of tackling with care how the duo meant a great deal to the families who watched their 30,000 plus shows and the relevancy of Horn's medical status at that point. In the days, weeks, and years following the attack, Siegfried and Roy arguably tried to control the news media to their benefit. One noteworthy example of this came from a CNN exclusive interview between Siegfried and Larry King. What you're seeing here was filmed 5 days after the attack, and Siegfried paints this picture that Montecore simply let Horn go once they were backstage. However, a more horrific version of events is now known to be true due to recent interviews from stagehands who actually helped save Horn's life that night. What King doesn't do in this interview is let audiences hear from counter-reports to Siegfried's timeline. One thing that could have helped the coverage in this interview is if CNN reached out to stagehands like Curtis Rowe, Mike Herbert, Dale Hurt, or animal handler Chris Lawrence. According to these men's accounts, as described by Curtis Rowe in the Apple podcast, they actually had to pull Montecore's tail once he dragged Horn backstage, and then they had to use a fire extinguisher to get the tiger to drop Horn's neck from its grip. And then they had to basically plug the puncture wounds to stop the bleedings until emergency crews arrived. All of what I just told you about the stagehands was not covered for years. From my research, I saw journalists reaching out to Siegfried and Roy, and not so much from the crew. I think part of the reason for why more news articles are starting to have the people who worked for Siegfried and Roy as their main interview is because we're starting to get a glimpse into a more negative version of events, and that's largely in part due to the animal handler Chris Lawrence. He spoke out in a 2019 Hollywood Reporter interview. Instead of hairdo and terrorist theories, the news was actually starting to shift to more credible accusations, like Roy Horn wasn't spending enough time bonding with some of the big cats like he had used to. And there's also another accusation that the USDA did not secure all the animal handlers' testimonies in the investigation. While Chris Lawrence's story did garner national and even international attention, it is worth mentioning how this 2020 ABC News special did kind of frame him as this mini scandal in the otherwise grand story of the Siegfried and Roy legacy.
Chris Lawrence has come forward now saying
I know
that Roy essentially was to blame. Was he?
No way.
And that this story is just a cover to save the brand and save the image.
No.
What do you say to that?
Well, I feel very sorry for Chris. He had in his life all these problems. You know what I mean?
I also want to talk about this strange moment that happens 45 minutes into the ABC 2020 special. So in the podcast, Curtis Rowe gives a full timeline of his experience of going backstage and what it was like getting Montecore off of Roy Horn. But on the ABC 2020 special, you just see this series of multiple fast-paced sound bites spliced together to perhaps add to the anticipation of the scene. And this is coming from sources who also spread that hairdo theory I talked about earlier. A potential concern with this splicing choice is that while it can create a televised effect of keeping audiences engaged via suspense, it perhaps hinders the journalistic integrity of the overall report by suggesting Rose, Fishbacher's, Wynn's, that all of their unique perspectives on what happened that night can somehow be conveniently combined into one overarching narrative, a narrative whose truth that has multiple nuances. Continuing with this example, I think an arguably more balanced report could have included more airtime devoted to the 267 workers who helped those productions every night, and overall just more airtime on how the tiger attack impacted the lives that were not Siegfried and Roy. All things considered, I think a great role model for journalists today is to just take a look back at the Apple podcast Wild Things, Siegfried and Roy, and see how Stephen Leckhart balances the coverage for Siegfried and Roy's legacy, for the people who loved them, but also hearing from the stagehands, from the dancers, from the non-famous individuals involved in this incident and who were also impacted by the tiger attack. And I just want to play this quick clip from the series finale that I think wraps up what I'm talking about here.
Looking at the full arc of their lives, it's remarkable what Siegfried and Roy achieved. Two boys raised in abusive homes amidst the wreckage of Nazi Germany meet unexpectedly on a cruise ship and forge a mystical partnership. For nearly half a century, these men crafted a spectacle that compelled millions of strangers from all over the world to sit in the dark together and be amazed. Although these iconic entertainers brought joy and wonder to so many, I can't ignore that offstage, away from the spotlight, there are people who say they were hurt both directly and indirectly by Siegfried and Roy.
Now, while news coverage of Siegfried and Roy has evolved in the podcast, that's not to say that that's the only way to get the story across. My research also had multiple local and national web articles that also gives a good balance. And in the end, their journey of making headlines is not finished. The Mirage will be closing soon. The Siegfried and Roy Secret Garden Dolphin Habitat recently closed this fall, and there's still uncertainty about what will happen to the remaining animals who live there, some of them who have lived there their entire lives. Ultimately, time will tell how the public, both tourists and Las Vegas natives, will remember the performers, their animals, the timeline of the tiger attack, and part of the responsibility for journalists of all media platforms is to try to tell that legacy as accurately as possible.
Roy made mistakes on the stage.
Their relationship with the animals was their magic power.